All right. So this is where most people get. This is where most people start with the Greeks. But the interesting thing about the Greeks is that the Greeks themselves don't admit that or try to profess that they were the innovators of a classical education. If you look, you see with, and I'm going to have to cheat and look at my information for once. You look at, I don't have it. You look at Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. You look at Ptolemy. You look at Pythagoras. If you study any of those, which you don't see in the history books, is that they visited the Jews. They visited the Egyptians. Pythagoras was known for going to Egypt to study his methods. Plato was known for going to Egypt not just for the Egyptian wisdom, but for Jewish philosophy and Jewish pedagogy and wisdom and education. So the Greeks were the first of their own to admit that they didn't invent any of this. What the Greeks did was they began to organize it. At this point, we had a jumble of education. If you came into the courts of Solomon, you could receive this education, but it couldn't really be duplicated outside of the temple. It came down to a few good men, a few good teachers, which is fine, but there wasn't any sort of organization to it. So what the Greeks bring to the table is that they organize it. You see this first with Plato. Plato is the first real figure that comes up in the Greeks, and he's kind of the organizer of the arts, which is the term we give him. At the time, there were only 5 arts that they had begun to establish. Plato went through the writings of Solomon, went through the Judaic tradition, went through the Egyptian philosophy, and he said there are 5 basic arts. Instead of teaching subjects, instead of teaching isolated material, we're going to teach arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, and the dialectic, or otherwise known as logic. Why did he start with arithmetic? Anybody know? Anybody want to guess?
Favorite subject?
I mean, well, that doesn't come till much later. I mean, that's Italian. All right, now.
Well, it's kind of a prelude to geometry. You have to know arithmetic to be able to do geometry, and then those are both preludes to astronomy. And music has mathematics in it as well. So I think that, it's just the foundational building block.
I like you. All right, now.
I'm an engineer.
We'll get to you engineering in a little bit. All right.
Building directly on what she said, it gives you a language. It gives you something that you can communicate through all the others with, something to kind of break it down and measure and actually have.
I did not coach her beforehand.
No,
all right?
I'm literally going off of what she just said.
Well, both of you are right in why the dialectic comes after music, comes after astronomy, after geometry, after arithmetic. But why arithmetic first?
Patterns?
More importantly, what's arithmetic? Numbers.
It's math and numbers.
Strictly, who said abstract? Abstract. Bingo. Abstract. It was immaterial. So Plato believed that we start with arithmetic because it's the first step of a soul outside of the material to the immaterial. And in an interesting way, even though you would not think about it in our modern age, numbers are highly spiritual. They get you to believe and comprehend something that you can't physically touch. Sure, you can take 2 iPhones and put them next to each other, but the number 2 doesn't exist. It's immaterial. So you go from there. It lifts your soul out of focusing on the material to the immaterial with numbers. Then geometry is the study of lines, so you see the relationship between numbers. Then you see astronomy, which is the relationship between shapes and bodies and spheres. Astronomy kind of gets it's not a very understood term for it in the modern age. It's very archaic when we talk about it being one of the 7 liberal arts, but that's what it is. It can be the study of the sun to the moon, but it's also just the relationship of me to you across the room, or gravity. So it's just the study of shapes, period, and bodies. And then you have music, which is the arrangement of numbers. It's about harmony and disharmony. And then, of course, Plato realized that none of this could be talked about if you could not order your thoughts. So for the first time in history, we have logic. So if you like logic, thank the Greeks. If you hate logic, thank the Greeks. All right? So that's what the Greeks bring to the table, organization and logic. So then we have the next part of that. At this point, if you were just to have an education off of Moses, David, Solomon, and Plato, you would have an education. but who has the time to read all of that, right? My wife will say me. But there are those that can. Even Thomas Aquinas, much further on, says the layman doesn't have time to study all of this. All right, someone who has their whole life dedicated to this study might be able to. But Socrates is kind of labeled as the father of the first set of textbooks because he takes all of those. He takes all of the writings of David, Moses, Solomon, Plato, and a few others, and he condenses them all into these books. So this is the first textbook series. Sorry, Aristotle. Scrub that from the camcorder record. All right. So that's the key thing with him, is that he organizes them into a set pattern. You have the organon, which is about reasoning. All right. You have the art of rhetoric, which is about speech. You have physics, which is, despite what it sounds like, it's natural philosophy or science for those who don't use the terminology or the jargon. You have metaphysics, which is sacred philosophy, and you have ethics, which is moral philosophy. So notice none of that touches science, history, geography, but it was all built in there. This was about having the ability to reason first, and you could tackle it. And again, you'll see that time and time again within a classical education, is it's not about trying to learn these subjects, but learn skills and arts that can be applied to any of these subjects.
So were all of the textbooks, none of them concerned, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, simply they were all mostly concerned on the last dialectic logic?
That was the primary emphasis, was textbooks of that set, but it flexed. These are what you would call the core text. So later, and this is an issue, what you're referring to right there was an issue that came along much later. That's the established set, but you would see included in there Euclid's geometry, Ptolemy's astronomy, and arithmetic as well. So their key was believing in the dialectic as the core, logic as the core, and then they would add certain textbooks according to the academy, according to the school of thought, the mentor. Keep in mind, at this point, classical education is still very fluid. It's being applied according not just to the country, the empire, but it's even being applied from teacher to teacher, magister to magister, which we're not even to Latin yet. But speaking of Latin, we have the Romans. So the Romans, what they bring to the table is Latin and rhetoric. Latin in this case, I think I'll save my spiel about Latin or we'll be here all night. But needless to say, Latin was the first language conscientiously created for the sake of thought, for the sake of speech. Even though it had been on the scene before then, even though it technically had existed very early on in its inception, those who were teaching became aware that Greek had its limitations. Greek had serendipitously involved, it had developed just as a language. One could say accidentally. It just grew with the culture, with the society. But we realized the limitations of Greek, and so the Romans took it up and said, we need a language that can articulate very fine points. This is the problem. That even the Greeks believed that half of our problems came down to sloppy language. I think anytime you talk to a teenager and you say two separate things that are very much different, but the teenager goes, oh, same thing, Yeah, you all know what I'm talking about as I'm looking at a teenager. All right? But so that was the purpose of Latin in this case. Aristotle, Plato, went through Cicero, believed that most of these problems could be resolved with a precise language. So the very thing that is a detriment to Latin is also its benefit. That's why we have Latin being the treasury of law, justice, theology, philosophy. We have it, of course, in the Psalms and the liturgies and the prayers and the church government, is because while there are some small things that could be open to interpretation, Latin is so precise that there's very little vagity, very little blurriness, very little confusion left to the language when it's properly translated. It's a language of stems and endings. And then you have rhetoric, of course. You have the likes here we have of, I'm going to have to check my card again just to make sure I get the names right. Cicero, Caesar, Virgil, Horace, and Livy. And how many of you know what rhetoric is? Or was that? Rhetorica? Yes, sir.
Speaking well.
Speaking well. Persuasion would probably be a more accurate translation, but speech, yes. So a lot of what Romans contributed to the classical education, you could say, is precision, is being able to articulate. And Thomas Aquinas comes back around to this later and says that articulation is the key. We can't even reason properly if we don't have the words and the grammar to be able to reason. So the Romans didn't give us a new subject or a new art per se, but they did give us clarity of language. So you have Cicero, you have Caesar with their speeches and persuasion. You have the Aeneid in the last slide. The key difference here, though, to note with what we call rhetoric these days, is that rhetoric here and rhetoric in a classical education was for the sake of everyone's greater good. It was for the sake of the community. So if you learned rhetoric to persuade someone of something, you weren't learning it to manipulate them via persuasion. In classic rhetoric, you had to consider your community, their needs. You had to consider your audience. And not like we see with commercials or ads where we consider our audience so that we can get them to buy more things. But you knew what the community needed, and you knew how to speak to them. If I wanted to speak to my wife, I'd probably use things in terms of art or dachshunds or coffee. All right, but it wasn't for the sake of manipulation. It was translation. You think St. Paul at the Areopagus, when he went and spoke in the Areopagus, and he said, "This statue you have, or this empty pedestal, it's to the unknown God." There was no duplicity in St. Paul. He was finding a way of analogy to be able to speak to and convert the peoples at the time. Interestingly enough to notice, he was so honest, most of them walked away. All right, but those that stayed behind were convinced by his words. He didn't sit there and find that point of connection to manipulate them, but found a connection between them. And that's what classic rhetoric is. It's not to pretend to say all rhetoricians did this correctly, but that was the aim of rhetoric back then, was once you had a truth, not your truth, but once you had the truth, you had to persuade everyone that it was the truth. Versus now we have, you could call individualistic rhetoric, which is you have something you want and you try to use rhetoric to persuade them so that you can get it.